A strange quietness surrounded the small, wrecked ship. The hum of the engines was gone. The once bright controls were dark and lifeless, reflecting the loneliness that gripped the human who had been stranded on this unfamiliar, alien world. It was supposed to be a routine exploration mission, nothing too complicated. But fate had other plans. The ship had crashed in a vast, uncharted part of the galaxy, far from Earth and the reach of any known civilization. The human, alone on this alien planet, stood at the broken cockpit window, staring out at the strange landscape that stretched before him. The planet was unlike anything he'd ever imagined. The sky had a purple hue, and the terrain was dotted with towering plants that seemed to glow with an eerie, bioluminescent light. The air smelled faintly sweet, like flowers mixed with something metallic, and the temperature was comfortably warm. But despite the peaceful surroundings, there was no denying the sinking feeling of isolation deep in his chest. As the days passed, the human, whose name was unimportant at the moment, worked tirelessly to assess the situation. He checked his communication devices every hour, but there was no signal. He attempted to send distress signals to Earth, but his attempts were unsuccessful. His only companion now was the wreckage of his ship, which provided little comfort. Still, he kept trying. After all, what else was there to do but survive? But as he explored the area around him, he began to notice something strange. There were no signs of intelligent life, no cities, no machines, no evidence of technology. He had expected to find something, anything, that would suggest the presence of other beings, even if only traces of their existence. But there was nothing. He made the decision to venture further, deeper into the unknown, hoping for any sign of life. His only tools were his survival pack, a couple of simple devices from the wreckage, and his instincts. He moved cautiously, knowing that caution was the only thing that could keep him safe in this strange new world. As he walked, he passed through vast fields of tall grass, their blades swaying in the wind. The sky above was still purple, but there was something about it that seemed off, like it was watching him. He shook the thought out of his head and focused on the path ahead. The last thing he needed was to start imagining things. Hours passed as he wandered through the alien terrain. But just as he was starting to feel his resolve falter, something unusual caught his attention, a figure in the distance. At first, he thought it was a mirage, a trick of the light. But as he moved closer, it became clearer. The figure was tall, slender, and unlike anything he had ever seen before. Its body was covered in a shimmering, translucent material that seemed to shift colors with every movement. The figure was female, or at least appeared to be. The human froze, his heart racing. This was the first living being he had encountered on this planet. He had no idea if this was a native or something else entirely, but he knew he had to approach cautiously. The figure, unaware of his presence, was walking slowly through the field, her steps delicate and graceful. She didn't seem to notice the human's approach, and he hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. Was this some kind of trap? Or was she a harmless creature? His instincts urged him to stay hidden, but curiosity pushed him forward. Slowly, step by step, he moved closer. He watched as the figure's movements became more deliberate, almost as if she were searching for something. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of something floral and sweet. His breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just any alien, this was a life form unlike anything he could have ever imagined. She wasn't just foreign in appearance, her whole presence seemed otherworldly. Despite the unease that churned in his stomach, he decided to reveal himself. He cleared his throat, the sound startlingly loud in the stillness of the alien landscape. The figure froze, her body stiffening in an instant. Then, she slowly turned her head in his direction, her eyes locking onto his with an expression of curiosity. The human took a tentative step forward, raising a hand in a peaceful gesture. But before he could speak, the figure tilted her head in confusion. Her long, hair-like appendages shifted with the movement, glimmering in the light. She made no sound at first, and for a moment, everything was eerily quiet. "Hello?" the human said, his voice unsure. The alien didn't respond right away. Instead, she slowly stepped back, as if unsure how to react to his presence. Her eyes scanned him from head to toe, as if taking in every detail. She looked confused, maybe even startled, but there was no hostility in her gaze. The human took another step forward, feeling a little more at ease. "I come in peace," he said again, this time with more confidence. The alien blinked, a strange, almost puzzled look crossing her face. She took another cautious step backward, her translucent skin catching the light in strange ways. Her body language indicated that she wasn't quite sure what to make of him. The human had no idea if she even understood his words, but it was all he had. He raised his hands again, showing that he meant no harm. "Are you alone?" he asked, his voice gentle. He knew the question was absurd, given that he had no idea what language she spoke, but it felt right to try. The alien paused, then glanced around the field. There was no sign of anyone else. Just the two of them, standing in this alien world. For the longest time, they stood in silence, neither of them knowing how to bridge the gap between their worlds. The human was starting to wonder if this was all a dream when the alien took a hesitant step forward. She didn't speak, but the way she approached him seemed peaceful. Almost like she was trying to communicate with him in her own way. The human held his breath as the alien reached out, touching his arm with one of her delicate, glowing hands. Her touch was soft, almost ethereal. He could feel a faint tingling sensation where her fingers made contact with his skin. He flinched, but he didn't pull away. He was too intrigued, too fascinated by what was happening. This was it, this was the moment that would change everything. The alien looked up at him, her eyes wide and full of wonder. She had no words, no language that the human could understand. But there was something in her expression, a kind of innocence, a lack of understanding of the situation they were in. At that moment, the human realized that this was not a typical encounter with an alien species. This was something completely different. The alien didn't seem to be hostile, nor did she seem to know what to make of him. She wasn't experienced in the ways of human communication or interaction. In fact, she appeared as lost as he was in this strange new world. He lowered his hands, slowly, and decided to sit down on a large stone nearby. He gestured for the alien to join him. He didn't know if she would understand, but he hoped that perhaps they could find a way to communicate. As the alien sat next to him, her movements tentative and unsure, the human couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. There was awe, fear, and something else, a deep sense of longing. A longing to connect with another being, to find a way to communicate in a world where words didn't seem to matter. And so, in the stillness of that alien world, surrounded by strange plants and under a sky that seemed to shimmer with mystery, the human and the alien girl sat together, not knowing what would come next. But for the first time since the crash, the human felt a spark of hope, hope that somehow, someway, they might figure out how to survive, together. The human and the alien sat in silence for what seemed like hours. The alien girl's presence beside him was comforting in a way he couldn't quite explain. There was no fear in her eyes, only curiosity and perhaps a little confusion. She observed him closely, her glowing skin pulsing faintly in the soft light of the alien world. Her otherworldly appearance made the human feel like an outsider in his own skin, yet there was something about her calm demeanor that eased his tension. The human had tried to communicate with her through gestures, pointing to himself and then to the sky, hoping she would understand the concept of a name or a place. She didn't seem to grasp it, though, and simply tilted her head, her hair like tendrils flowing around her face. He felt a pang of frustration. How could he explain his situation if they couldn't even communicate the basics? After a long pause, the alien girl reached out again, this time to touch the human's hand, her delicate fingers brushing lightly over his skin. The human stiffened at first but didn't pull away. She didn't seem to mean any harm. Instead, there was something tender in her touch, like a child exploring something new, something foreign. The human let out a breath, realizing that he had been holding it for far too long. He slowly lowered his hand to the ground, reaching into his survival pack. He had brought along a few basic tools that might help in communicating, an old tablet with a small screen and a translator device. Neither had worked so far, but he had an idea. The alien girl watched closely as he powered on the tablet. The screen flickered for a moment before displaying a simple line of text, written in the language of his home planet. He set the device down in front of her, hoping she might recognize something. She looked at the screen, her eyes wide with curiosity, but she didn't seem to understand the symbols. Instead, she looked back at him, the same gentle confusion in her gaze. It was clear that she didn't have the capacity to read the human language. The human's frustration began to grow. How could he bridge the gap between them if they couldn't even share a basic understanding? But then, as if sensing his distress, the alien girl did something unexpected. She gently touched the device and began to trace her fingers across the screen, moving them in strange patterns that the human couldn't quite make sense of. It was as if she was trying to create her own symbols, her own language. A strange sense of wonder filled the human. Was she trying to communicate with him in her own way? The thought lingered in his mind as he watched her, her delicate fingers moving across the screen with a sense of purpose. She wasn't just passively observing, she was actively engaging with him, trying to understand, just as he was trying to understand her. For a moment, the human felt a bond, something that transcended language, something deeper. Maybe they couldn't speak to each other with words, but that didn't mean they couldn't connect. Perhaps the way forward wasn't through spoken language at all, but through shared gestures, actions, and mutual respect. He reached out carefully, touching the screen beside her, showing her that it was okay to keep exploring. He offered a small smile, a silent encouragement. The alien girl tilted her head slightly, then returned a hesitant smile of her own. It was small, but it was enough. They weren't alone anymore, not really. The isolation that had gnawed at him for days seemed a little less sharp now. In that moment, the human realized that survival wasn't just about fixing the ship, or sending out a distress signal, it was about making a connection in this vast, lonely world. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step toward getting home. As the sun began to set, casting a soft orange glow over the alien landscape, the human sat beside the girl, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't known in days. Whatever came next, they would face it together, one step at a time. The next few days felt like a blur of discovery, confusion, and growing understanding. The human and the alien girl fell into an unspoken rhythm. Each day, the human would explore a little further from the wreckage, trying to understand the strange world around him. Each night, they would sit together beneath the alien sky, a sky that looked so different from Earth's, yet somehow comforting in its own way. The alien girl was becoming more comfortable with the human's presence. She would watch him intently as he worked on repairing the ship's broken systems, her glowing eyes following his every move. He could tell she was curious, but also cautious, unsure how to interact with him. Still, she never showed fear, and over time, she began mimicking his actions. One morning, the human noticed that she had picked up a rock and was holding it in her hands, turning it over as though she were studying it. He was fascinated. Was she trying to learn from him? Did she see him as a teacher, or was she simply trying to understand what he was doing in this strange, unfamiliar world? He couldn't help but smile as she continued to examine the rock. Her movements were delicate and thoughtful, almost childlike, yet there was a certain grace to them. She seemed like someone who was eager to learn but didn't know where to begin. In many ways, she reminded him of a child encountering the world for the first time. With a soft sigh, the human decided to try something new. He stood up and walked over to a nearby tree, a towering structure that seemed to pulse with life. The leaves were a deep violet color, and the branches swayed gently in the wind, despite there being no visible breeze. The human reached up, breaking off a small branch, and brought it back to the alien girl. She looked up at him with wide eyes, her expression filled with curiosity as he held the branch in front of her. He pointed to it, then to the sky, and finally to the ground, trying to show her that it was part of the world, something living, something they could both share. The alien girl took the branch from him cautiously, her fingers brushing against it. Then, she did something that surprised him, she gently pressed it to her skin. For a moment, the human thought she might be testing it, or perhaps feeling its texture. But then she seemed to smile, a soft, knowing smile that made the human's heart skip a beat. It was as if she had understood his gesture, in her own way. Slowly, the alien girl began to trace the branch's length with her fingers, mimicking his earlier action with the rock. The human watched, fascinated, realizing that they were no longer just two beings from different worlds. Somehow, they had found a connection. They were learning from each other. Over time, he began teaching her more. He showed her how to use the small tools he had recovered from the wreckage, demonstrating how they could be used for simple tasks. At first, she struggled, her delicate hands not accustomed to the human-designed tools, but she was persistent. And with every attempt, she grew more skilled. In turn, she began showing him things he never would have thought of on his own. One evening, the alien girl took the human by the hand and led him to a distant part of the planet. He had never ventured that far before, but something in her gesture made him trust her. She guided him to a small clearing, where the ground was soft and the air filled with a sweet, intoxicating scent. The sky above shimmered with colors that seemed to move, almost like the auroras on Earth, but more vivid, more alive. The human was mesmerized by the scene. There were no words for what he was seeing, only awe. He glanced at the alien girl, who was standing beside him, her gaze fixed on the sky. For the first time, he realized that she wasn't just showing him something new, she was sharing a part of herself with him. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was something more. They were connecting on a deeper level, a level that transcended language, appearance, and even the vast distance between their two worlds. As the stars began to twinkle above them, the human realized how far they had come in such a short time. When he had first crash-landed on this planet, he had felt nothing but hopelessness. He had been alone, isolated in a world that seemed indifferent to his existence. But now, as he sat beside the alien girl, watching the sky together, he didn't feel alone anymore. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were building something, even if they couldn't fully understand it. Something that was more than just companionship, something that was, for lack of a better word, friendship. And in a world as strange and unpredictable as this one, that was more than he could have ever hoped for. As the days blended into one another, the human and the alien girl continued to learn from each other. Their bond had grown deeper, more intricate, yet still fragile. The human had never expected to find any form of companionship on this distant planet. But here they were, two beings from entirely different worlds, sharing moments of quiet understanding and mutual respect. The alien girl seemed to grow more comfortable with the human's presence. She had started to mimic his movements more often, following him with curiosity as he worked on repairing the ship. Sometimes, she would gesture to the tools, trying to understand how to use them for herself. It wasn't always perfect, she had a delicate, almost cautious way of handling things, but the human couldn't help but admire her perseverance. One day, after a long morning of fruitless attempts to restart the ship's main engine, the human sat down on a nearby rock, wiping the sweat from his brow. His frustration had been building for days. There were so many systems to fix, so many variables, and he was beginning to feel overwhelmed. He had no experience with alien technology, and the ship was a complicated mess of wires, circuits, and machinery that made no sense to him. The alien girl watched from a distance, her glowing eyes following his every move. For a moment, she seemed to consider his state of mind, and then, as though sensing his frustration, she approached him quietly. She knelt beside him, her presence soothing in a way that was hard to describe. The human glanced at her, and their eyes met. There was no judgment, no pressure, just an understanding, as if she knew exactly what he was feeling. She reached out with one of her long, ethereal arms and gently touched his shoulder. The human tensed at the contact, but he didn't pull away. There was a gentleness in her touch, a silent offer of support. For the first time in days, he felt the weight of his isolation lift, even if just a little. In her own way, she was reminding him that he wasn't truly alone. The alien girl then stood and motioned for him to follow. Confused but curious, the human did just that. She led him away from the wreckage, through the glowing, bioluminescent fields. There was no real destination in mind, but the human was grateful for the distraction. As they walked, the alien girl spoke to him in her soft, melodic language, though he didn't understand a word. He had gotten used to the sound of her voice by now. It was calming, almost musical, like the wind through trees or the murmur of distant waves. They walked in silence for what felt like hours, the alien landscape unfolding before them in an endless stretch of color and light. The alien girl seemed to know the land well, her steps sure and confident as she led him deeper into the wilderness. He couldn't help but feel a sense of awe at the beauty of it all, the vibrant plant life, the distant mountains shimmering with an otherworldly glow, and the strange creatures that flitted between the trees, their movements almost like flashes of light. Eventually, they came to a small lake, its surface smooth and reflective. The human could see the sky mirrored perfectly on the water, the colors shifting in mesmerizing patterns. The alien girl knelt by the edge of the lake and dipped her fingers into the water, watching as the ripples spread outward. The human sat beside her, watching her movements with a sense of wonder. There was something serene about the moment, something peaceful in the way she interacted with her environment. It was as though she had lived here her whole life, in perfect harmony with the planet around her. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The days on the alien planet began to blur together as the human and the alien girl settled into an unspoken routine. With each passing moment, the human felt more at ease in her presence. The initial unease he had felt when stranded on this world, alone and afraid, had begun to dissipate, replaced by an unexpected sense of belonging. The alien girl, though still largely mysterious to him, had become his closest companion in this strange, hostile world. Each day, they spent time exploring the planet's wild terrain, learning from each other and growing accustomed to one another's presence. The alien girl had become more expressive, her movements more fluid and confident as they worked side by side. She no longer watched the human's actions from a distance, but often mirrored his behavior, experimenting with tools and objects, even if she still struggled to use them properly. One morning, the human decided to show her something he had found while exploring the nearby forest. It was a small, bioluminescent flower, unlike any he had ever seen before. The petals glowed softly in the early light, and the flower seemed to hum faintly when touched, almost as if it were alive. He carefully picked the flower, holding it up to her. The alien girl's eyes widened as she saw it for the first time, and she reached out to touch the delicate bloom. She traced the flower's petals with the tips of her fingers, her face full of wonder. Her glowing skin shimmered in the soft light as she inspected the flower. The human smiled, glad to see her fascinated by something so simple. It was in moments like these that he realized just how much they had learned to communicate without the need for words. They shared a sense of awe and wonder at the world around them, even if they didn't understand everything about it. "Do you think it's alive?" the human asked softly, though he knew she couldn't understand him. But the question wasn't for her, it was more for himself, a way of trying to process his thoughts. The alien girl didn't respond with words, of course, but she gently cupped the flower in her hands as if cradling something precious. Then, she closed her eyes for a moment, as if listening to the hum of the plant, and placed the flower delicately on the ground. She looked back at the human, and this time, there was a spark of recognition in her gaze, a silent understanding. It was in that moment that the human felt the weight of their situation. They might never be able to communicate the way he had with others on Earth. Words might remain out of reach for them, but perhaps they didn't need them. There was a deep connection between them, one forged through actions, through shared experiences, through moments like this. As the day wore on, the human realized that they had not only begun to survive on this alien world, they had begun to thrive, in their own way. Despite all the obstacles they faced, despite the wreckage of the ship and the lack of a way home, they were no longer completely lost. The bond they had formed was a lifeline, an anchor in the midst of the vast unknown. That night, they sat together under the stars once more. The alien girl was quieter than usual, her glowing eyes reflecting the distant stars above. The human sat beside her, content in the stillness. He had always been a solitary person, someone who preferred his own company over the bustle of crowds. But here, in this strange place, with this alien girl beside him, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, peace. The silence stretched on, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a silence that spoke volumes, a silence filled with understanding, trust, and shared experiences. In the quiet of the night, the human could feel the pulse of the planet beneath them, as if it too was alive, aware of their presence. Eventually, the alien girl broke the silence, looking at him with a soft, almost questioning expression. She didn't speak, but the way she gazed at him, intense, but somehow tender, made him feel like she was asking him something. "What is it?" he asked gently, sensing her desire for connection. For a moment, the alien girl hesitated, then reached out and touched his hand, her fingers soft and warm against his skin. The human didn't pull away. He let her explore, and as she traced the lines of his hand, he understood that this was her way of asking for reassurance, for comfort, just as he had done many times before. He squeezed her hand gently, offering her the same silent reassurance she had given him so many times. "We're okay," he said quietly, even though he knew she couldn't understand his words. "We'll be okay." The alien girl smiled then, a small, glowing smile that lit up her face in the dim light. It was an expression of quiet understanding, and for a moment, the human felt like they had crossed an unspoken threshold, a threshold where words no longer mattered. And in that moment, he realized that the wrecked ship, the isolation, the vast expanse of the alien world, they didn't define him anymore. What mattered now was the connection they had formed. In a world where everything was uncertain, that was the one constant he could hold on to. It was enough. As the weeks passed, the human and the alien girl continued to grow closer, their bond evolving in ways neither could have anticipated. The human had long accepted that he might never return to Earth, that he would never again see his home or his family. But as he spent more time with the alien girl, he began to realize that this planet, this strange and beautiful world, had become his new home, at least for now. The ship, once a symbol of hope, now lay forgotten in the corner of his mind. He had given up on fixing it. It had become clear that the technology on this planet was too advanced and too different for him to comprehend. There were no signs of rescue on the horizon, no signal from Earth, and no indication that anyone would be coming for him anytime soon. But as each day passed, he began to accept that perhaps he wasn't meant to go back. Maybe his purpose here, on this alien world, was to build something new. The alien girl, too, seemed to adapt to their new life. She had become more expressive over time, using gestures and actions to communicate with him. They had created their own way of understanding each other, and in doing so, they had built a language of their own, a language of shared experience. She would show him the flowers that grew in the meadows, each one unique, each one a mystery waiting to be uncovered. And in return, he would show her the tools he had, the ones he still used to maintain the small makeshift shelter they had built together. One afternoon, after a particularly long day of working on the shelter, the human sat down on a rock, exhausted. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the landscape. The alien girl walked over to him, her steps slow and deliberate, and sat beside him. She looked up at the sky, her glowing eyes reflecting the fading light of the day. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The stillness was comforting, as if the world around them had quieted just for them. The human glanced at her, wondering if she, too, was beginning to understand the nature of their strange relationship. They were no longer just two beings from different worlds. They were companions, survivors, partners in this shared existence. He thought back to the days when he first arrived on this planet, to the feelings of fear and loneliness that had consumed him. Back then, the world had seemed vast, cold, and empty. Now, it felt different. It felt like home. "I never thought I would be here," the human said softly, speaking his thoughts aloud even though he knew the alien girl couldn't understand. "I thought I'd be back on Earth, back with the people I know. But now, I don't know." The alien girl turned to him, her expression full of curiosity. She reached out, touching his arm gently, as if she understood the weight of his words. It was a simple gesture, but it meant everything. He smiled at her, a small, genuine smile that reached his eyes for the first time in what felt like forever. Maybe this is where I'm meant to be," he continued, looking at the distant horizon. "Maybe it's not about going back. Maybe it's about being here with you." She looked at him, and for a brief moment, their eyes locked in understanding. The human had always thought of home as a place, a physical location, a space defined by walls and familiar faces. But now, as he sat beside the alien girl, he realized that home wasn't a place at all. Home was wherever you found connection, wherever you found peace. And in this alien world, with this alien girl beside him, he had found both. The alien girl's soft, glowing touch remained on his arm, a silent promise of solidarity. They didn't need words to communicate anymore. They understood each other in a way that transcended language, culture, and species. And in that quiet, unspoken understanding, they had found something profound, a bond that, despite the vast distance between their worlds, had brought them closer than they could have ever imagined. As the stars began to appear overhead, the human and the alien girl sat in silence, watching the sky. It was the same sky they had gazed at countless times before, but tonight, it felt different. It felt like it was theirs, a sky shared between two beings who had found each other in the vastness of the universe. In the end, the human knew that they didn't need to search for answers anymore. There was no need to fix the ship or wait for rescue. They had already found what mattered most. They had found each other. And in this strange, alien world, that was more than enough.